This is the start of part 2 of the course, where our focus will shift to SOAP-based web services. Remember, this isn't just a spring course. I'm assuming no previous knowledge of web services, so in this chapter we'll do the groundwork and cover the basics. There won't be any spring in this chapter. We'll start with a high-level overview of SOAP. I'll keep this really basic for now so that we've got all the fundamentals. Perhaps the most important of the basics is the interestingly named WSDL, so we'll spend some time on understanding that. But the biggest part of this chapter will be concentrating on JAX-WS. This is a standard built-in Java library for building web services, and it actually makes the process quite simple. If you've already worked with Jax-WS before, then you can safely skip this chapter. But if not, let's begin. We've seen now that Java features built-in a library called RMI. And that's great, it's pretty easy to use, but the restrictions are that both the client and the server must be written in Java. Oh, and also firewalls can be a problem, because the protocol between the two sides is a custom protocol invented by Java. If you did the chapters on Hessian, Burlap and HTTP Invoker, you'll have seen that we can get around the firewall problem because these solutions use HTTP. But still, the client and server will have to be written in Java. And the real problem with those three solutions is that they're kind of non-standard. They're quite obscure. In the early 1990s and the early 2000s, I guess, some efforts were made by various bodies to create some kind of remoting standard that would be language and operating system neutral. You might have heard of CORBA. That was the 1990s effort, but that wasn't all that successful. It did have some success, but it didn't set the world alight because I would say it was very complicated and expensive to implement. You needed special software to make it work, and that software was often expensive. After CORBA came web services, and specifically a protocol called SOAP. Now, there is another type of web service called REST, which we'll be studying later, but for now, I'm going to use the terms SOAP and web service interchangeably. SOAP was invented by a team at Microsoft, and it went on to become much more successful than CORBA. It is still a bit complicated, but it was much kind of freer in that you don't need much in the way of special software to make it work. It uses the well understood and well used standards of HTTP and XML for the communication. If you're interested, let's get this out of the way first. SOAP originally stood for Simple Object Access Protocol, but it's one of those contrived acronyms that didn't really mean anything. For example, the S bit for simple is pretty inaccurate, as really, to be honest, SOAP isn't very simple at all. It is simpler than CORBA, but there are quite a lot of complexities in SOAP, as you're going to find out in this chapter. But although it was invented at Microsoft, it was very quickly transferred to the W3C committee. And they're the people in charge of maintaining standards for the World Wide Web. So you can think of it as a fairly free and open standard. And you certainly don't have to pay Microsoft or anybody else any money to write a web service. So let's start with a simplified view of how SOAP web services work. Now, as this chapter is concentrating on the basics of SOAP, I will leave some details out, but I hope it gives you the general idea of how things work. So, over here, on the left-hand side, we have a client, and crucially, this can be written in any language. It could be Python, it could be C++, Visual Basic, Java, whatever. Over here, on the right-hand side, we have the server code. Now, for us, this is going to be Java. So I have here, for example, a Java service class called Employee Management Service. But once again, it didn't have to be Java. It could have been any code and any language. Now, the way that SOAP works is the client needs to be able to invoke a network call using HTTP. Now, I know I've been saying the client could be written in any language. What I really mean is that language needs to be able to make HTTP calls. So really, I mean most languages, as most languages will be able to do this. Just as a quick digression, it doesn't actually have to be HTTP. You can, for example, use something like SMTP, which is the emailing protocol, which means you could send an email to the web service and get a reply back as an email. Now that's great, but really that's a relatively obscure way of working in web services. If at least at first you think of web services as being operations invoked using HTTP, then you won't be far wrong. Now for the second part. The request that we're going to make to the server will be coded up in the form of an XML message. Now, this has a lot of advantages. The main one being that it's really easy to construct this message because it's not some kind of complex binary format. Once again, any language will be able to construct XML messages, or at least as long as that language is capable of generating strings, which, after all, is all an XML document is. Now, the form of this XML document, and I am heavily simplifying here, but the concept of it is that it will look something like this. The message is asking for the operation that we want to be performed, in this case, get employee by ID. And then, embedded in the message is the data that the operation needs, the input parameters. So, for example, here we have an employee with an ID of 738. So this data is going to be sent to the server, and I'm going to call this the message. And once the server receives that message, the server can now process it. And I hope you get the idea. The server code can be any language as long as it's capable of constructing a string in response. And that string is going to be another XML document, this time the response here, and it might look like this, and this is the data that the client requested. In this case, it's the details of that particular employee. Now, a quick note here on the term web service. It's a really misleading term for many people because this whole setup has got nothing to do with the web. There's no browser involved here. There's no web pages going on. There's no HTML. It's code on the left-hand side, on the client side, and it's code on the right-hand side for the server. And now for a really important term in web services, and that is WSDL. It stands for Web Service Description Language. You might sometimes see it referred to as Web Services Definition Language. But more importantly, we usually pronounce this as WSDL. And the idea behind a WSDL is that, well, imagine you have been given the job of writing a client application that is going to access some web service. We didn't write that web service. It's maybe owned by a third-party company. How do you know how it works? How do you know what operations are available? And how do you know what XML data is required in the messages? Of course, you could ask the company who built that service, and maybe they could supply you with some kind of a reference manual, but the real answer is we use the WSDL. You can think of the WSDL as being a kind of online reference manual for the web service. But it's not a human-readable reference manual, it's more a machine-readable reference manual, and our client can use tools to access and understand that WSDL. So the WSDL is going to contain a list of all of the operations in the service, together with a specification of what parameters are required in the messages. So you can think of the WSDL as being a specification of the web service. If you like, a contract definition telling the clients how to call the service. Now, this WSDL is an XML document itself, and this caption here is showing a heavily simplified example. Real WSDLs are much more complicated than this, and we will see a proper one later, and we'll even be writing one for ourselves. But I've really distilled a WSDL down to the important information. So if the web service has a WSDL like this, it's telling us that there are two types of messages that we can send and receive. The first message here is called getEmployee-by-ID request. And looking at the tag inside, it's telling us that there is one, if you like, parameter. The WSDL calls it a part, but I'm going to call it a parameter. And that's called ID, which needs to be of type integer. There's another type of message called getEmployee-by-ID response. This one having two parts or parameters, the first name and surname, both of which are strings. I think on the caption earlier, I had a few other fields, but of course they would just be added as well. But those two tags just show us the types of messages that can be sent and received by the web service. This block down here is the full description of what the web service can do. We'll be seeing this phrase port quite a lot as we get a bit deeper with our WSDLs. If you want to think of a port as just being the web service itself, then you won't go far wrong. So this tag here is saying that the web service is called the Employee Management Web Service. And looking inside that tag, we're going to see a series of operations. I only have one operation. Of course, there would be more than this generally, but the one operation here is called getEmployee-by-ID. So I hope that makes sense. This is one of the operations that we can carry out on this web service. It's telling us that the input for the getEmployee-by-ID service is the getEmployee-by-ID request message. That's the message that was defined higher up in the WSDL. And the output from this operation is going to be getEmployee-by-ID response. And I hope you can see that by doing it this way, that means that these messages can potentially be reused by other operations on the web service. So that's a very simple description of what a WSDL is going to look like. As I said, we'll see a proper one quite soon. So that's the basics of web services. But how do we actually write one? Well, I want to make a really important point here, and that is we don't need SOAP or any special libraries to do web services in Java. And that's because for a long time now, Java has featured built into the library a sublibrary called Jax-WS. It's another not particularly nice acronym. It actually stands for the Java API for XML-based web services. Well, that's a bit of a mouthful, but you can just think of it as the Java API for SOAP web services. And the key thing is, it is built into Java. No special downloads are needed. Now we're going to see when we go a little bit deeper with SOAP web services that Spring is going to help us a lot. But you don't need Spring in order to do a web service. And in order to illustrate that, I'm going to go back into Eclipse now, and together we can use Jax-WS just to see the basics of how to write a working, operating web service using Jax-WS and no special libraries. And that will help us to establish the principles. Oh, just before I go there though, I should mention that in earlier versions of Java, there was an API called JAX-RPC. That was the Java API for XML-based remote procedure calls. It was a very confusing acronym that, but actually that was an API for accessing SOAP-based web services. But that API has now been deprecated, it's been left behind by Java, and it has been fully replaced by JAX-WS. But you never know, you might come across some references to JAX-RPC and you might think you're missing out on something, but you're really not. JAX-WS is where the action is. The two key features of JAX-WS. Firstly, we're going to be able to write our service class using regular plain Java. But using JAX-WS, we'll be able to automatically convert that class into a proper functioning web service without needing to deal with any XML at all. And also, JAX-WS will generate the WSDL for us. The second, and this is coming from the client side of things, if you're writing a client application to a web service, then JAX-WS will enable you to write your Java calls without needing to ever even look at the WSDL, which can be really valuable in some situations. I must point out that this automatic generation of the WSDL, it can be a good thing, and it certainly makes life a lot easier when you're getting started with web services. But some web service experts think that you should write the WSDL manually. And if you're writing the client, they think that you should inspect the WSDL manually. And there's a lot of credit in that point of view. But in this chapter and the chapter that's following, where we're going to be using Spring with SOAP, we are going to generate the WSDLs automatically. In a later chapter, we'll come back and have a look at how you could do things by hand if you really wanted to. So for the rest of this chapter, we're going to experiment with JAX-WS to write a very basic web service. There will be no Spring involved here at all. And to keep things clean, I recommend that you close all your existing files, and I'm even going to temporarily close our CRM system project and our client application. And I'm going to build a completely new project, nice and clean. And I'm going to call this the JAX-WS test server. Now notice we've got no special libraries in this project. It is a completely fresh Java project. And I'm going to start by defining a new interface. And this interface is going to be the usual service interface. I think just for this test project, I'm going to go with the employee management example. And of course, in the next chapter, we'll apply this to our customer relationship management system. Let's just call this interface employee service. And rather like on the captions, I'm going to have in here a method which is going to return an employee object, and it's going to be called getEmployee by ID. And it's going to take in a single string parameter, which is the ID. Now, of course, for this project, we don't have an employee class, so I'll left click on the error marker here and go for the quick fix of creating the class employee. And I really should be using packages here. So I'm going to call the package employee management.domain, because this is going to be a domain class called employee. And we'll keep this simple. We'll just have a string in here called ID, and we'll have a name, and of course in real life we would have a lot more fields than that. I've just realized they should be privates really if we're doing proper good Java encapsulation. Now I'm not going to do anything very clever in here. I'm just going to have a constructor, so I'll do source and generate constructor using fields. And I'm also going to put in here a toString method, which is just going to return, and we'll just return the name of that employee. Of course, in real life, there would be a lot more methods in here. Now, since I created a package for the domain, then I really ought to create a package for the services as well. Now, you might not be really wanting to bother creating packages. I strongly recommend that you create a package here. I'm going to call it services, employee management.services. You're going to see when we start generating the WSDLs and so on that packages are really important when it comes to SOAP-based web services. So I'll drag the employee service class into there. Now, before I forget, I'm going to go back to the employee class, and it's important to have a get and a set method for each of the fields in here. If you forget to do that, then you'll notice that when we go further with our web service, you'll find that the parameters don't appear in, for example, the WSDL that gets generated. It needs the get and set methods in order to be able to add them to the WSDL. So let's add those in now. We'll do a source and generate getters and setters. Make sure they're both ticked and click on OK. And it's just added those to the bottom of the class. I'm always forgetting to do that when I'm working on web services. And then I discover a little bit later on down the line that for some reason my ID and name aren't appearing in the web service. If that happens to you, then you'll know you need a pair of get and sets for each field that you want to be part of the employee. Next job then is to implement this interface. And actually, before I move on, I should point out that I often forget this. In JAX-WS, you don't need this interface. It's just a habit, really, that led me to write this interface class. There's certainly no requirement to have one in web services in Java. I could have just gone ahead and written the implementation class. But that's no big deal. I'm going to have a new class in the services package. This is going to be called employee service impl. It's going to need to implement the interface. So I'll add the employee service interface right there. And notice I've got the inherited abstract methods box ticked. So I get a stub implementation of that method. Now, because we're just testing here, I'm not going to do anything clever in this service. I'm going to return a hard-coded employee. That employee is going to have an ID of 1 and a name of Dick Chesterward. Of course, in real life, we'd have a proper implementation in here, and that's exactly what we'll be doing when we go over to Spring. I need to be able to convert this into a web service. Therefore, I need a WSDL describing what's inside here, and I need to set up some infrastructure code that's going to convert the incoming XML messages into the right format. And I also need some kind of infrastructure code which is going to convert this employee Java object that I'm returning here into an XML response message so that the clients can consume it. And to achieve all of that, all I need to do in JAX-WS is add on a single annotation at web service. And notice it is a capital S on the service. I always forget that. And in fact, in an earlier take, I got that completely wrong. As long as you've spelt that correctly, then a Control-Shift and O will import the web service annotation. And I want to make this point again. I think it's quite an important one, is that remember we have no special libraries in this project, but web services are fully built in to modern Java development kits. And well, that's it. That's all we have to do to make this class be a web service. Of course, we have to somehow publish this web service. Now, the usual process for publishing a web service would be to take this class and to upload it to a server like Tomcat. Now, that's exactly what we're going to do in later chapters, especially when we start using Spring. But in JAX-WS, there is a very useful, quick and dirty web server that you can use. Or at least there is if you're using the standard Sun Java development kit. This feature of a sort of built-in quick and dirty web server is not a part of the JAX-WS standard, so it depends on which implementation you're using as to whether you get it. So if you're in the position of using a different virtual machine, for instance, the OpenJDK, then this might not work for you. But I'm assuming that most of you are using the standard Sun JDK, so the following steps should work. If it doesn't, don't panic, because you can just watch from this point onwards. In the next chapter, we'll be deploying to a proper web server. But what we can do is we can write a quick class, which I'm going to call the exporter class. You can call it anything you like. And I wish I'd ticked the box. We need a public static void main method, the usual format. We're going to make a call on a class called endpoint. Now, I can't import that just yet because I haven't called any methods on it, but if you hit the dot, depending on the version of Eclipse you're in, it's kind of guessing which endpoint class we're talking about. We're going to call the method called publish. So if you can just select publish from the list, the thing I want to point you towards is notice the import there, which was automatically added when we selected publish. The import is coming from the javax.xml.ws package, which is in fact JAXWS. The first parameter is the URL that we want this service to be accessed from. Now, this is something that I haven't mentioned so far. I didn't mention it in my brief overview, but every web service, because it's accessible through HTTP, is going to have a URL. Now, that URL is a regular web-style URL, so it's going to begin with http://. And now we would use the IP address of the server that we're deploying to. Now, because we're not really deploying this, we can use the stock IP address of localhost. You probably know that means just the IP address that this particular computer is running on. We generally use a port when we're developing, so I'm going to use the port of 8080, which is quite a common port to be using. Oh, by the way, before you run this application, if you're still running Tomcat from an earlier chapter, make sure you close Tomcat down, otherwise we're going to clash with Tomcat. But the interesting thing is that because we're kind of in control of this little web server that we're setting up, we can now use any pattern we like. And I'm going to emphasize that by putting any name you like separated by /. And I'm going to end it with, let's say, employee service. Now, of course, that's a silly URL, but I want to do that just to really emphasize that this URL isn't being automatically generated at any stage. We had complete control of what that URL should be. We need to remember this URL, and in real life, we would be giving our third-party customers or the people who want to call the web service, we would be giving them this URL. Now, the second parameter is a simple one. This needs to be an instance of the class that we want to become a web service. So in our case, that's employee service impl. We need to instantiate employee service impl. I sometimes forget that I need a new instance there. Sometimes I accidentally do employee service impl.class. And you will get an exception if you do that. But that's it. And one of the things I love about JAX-WS is just with this line of code, that's going to take our employee service impl and it's going to wrap around all of that XML-based plumbing code that's going to make it a true, full-fledged, standards-compliant web service. I'll just say one more time, though, that this line of code will only work if your implementation of JAX-WS supports endpoint publishing. That really means that as long as you're using the Sun virtual machine, or I should say now the Oracle JDK, then this will be fine. If not, then you're just going to have to watch and you can wait until the next chapter when we will deploy our web services to Tomcat. But all being well, if I now do a right click and a run as Java application, you're going to see that apparently nothing happens. If you have got any typos, you might get an exception here, but assuming there's no exceptions, I'm waffling deliberately here just to give it some time. That does appear to be up and running. So now effectively what we have is a little mini HTTP server sat waiting for requests. And the next thing now would be for somebody, maybe a third party, to write a client application to connect to our web service. So we'll do just that in a few moments, but the obvious thing to try is it would be interesting to see what happens if we put this URL into a web browser. Now, before I do that, I want to be clear about this. You don't access web services using web browsers. You know that from the discussion we had just a few moments ago. We're going to access the web service using code. But because this is using HTTP, if we try to access this service at this URL, we might see something just to give us a clue that things are working. So I just copied that string from the URL in the code, and I've just pasted it in here. Of course, it was a ridiculous URL. If I hit enter, then this is interesting. Now, what we're seeing here is effectively just a test web page. The implementation of JAX-WS has decided that if you access this address through a web browser, what you'll see is some basic information about the web service. It really is very basic implementation, but there is one really interesting piece of information on this page, and that's the link you can see here. That's a link to the WSDL. Now remember, we never wrote a WSDL, but one of JAX-WS's jobs is to automatically generate one. If you have a look at the URL, you'll see actually it's the URL of the web service followed by $WSDL. And that's the pattern that JAX-WS always follows. Let's click the link to that. And I did warn you that the real WSDLs are significantly more complicated than the example one I gave you on a caption before. But you should be able to see just by scanning down this that you recognize some of the elements. For example, here you can see the definition of a message called getEmployeeById. There's one there called getEmployeeById response. The difference is, though, you'll notice that inside that message, the part does reference parameters, but doesn't actually show any of the parameters. We expect an ID in here, and the response should have an ID and a name. Now, this is getting a little bit more advanced, but the reason for this is that the definition of the messages are in a separate file. And you can find that separate file here. This URL is pointing to what's called the XSD, which is a standard XML term meaning a schema definition. Now, if you don't know what that means, then we will be covering that in a later chapter. You don't really need to know it for now, but just in case you're interested, I'll paste that link into the browser. For example, we can see that the definition of an employee is that it should have an ID and a name. So if we go back, let's have a look at some of the other detail. We have there the port type, which remember is really the name of the web service. And the default name of the web service is just the name of the class that defined it. So employee service input. You can change the name of the web service by adding that as a parameter to the web service annotation actually, but I won't bother doing that. I'll go with the default. Inside the port, we have one single operation called getEmployeeById. Of course, if we add more methods into that Java class, then further operations will be added here. And we can see that there's an input and an output to that operation. I'm not going to look in any more detail at what follows. The binding is a little bit more complicated. The service, I guess, is quite interesting. That's really just containing the URL of the actual service itself. Now, we already know what that is because it's very similar to the URL of the WSDL, but sometimes that address can be completely different. So that's a WSDL. Not very pleasant to look at, I must admit, and it's quite good that it's been generated for us, but it's really good to know that it's there. That proves our web service is deployed and it's up and running. Okay, so we have now written and published a working web service. We've done all of the work over here on the right-hand side. But now we're going to look at what things are like if your job is to write a client for this application. Now, remember from our discussion before that what the client needs to do is it needs to construct an XML message of the type you can see here, of the kind of structure you can see at the top. And it needs to send that message across to the server. And you know now that that's going to be to the URL that we defined earlier. By the way, if you're interested in a bit more detail, you're going to send this message via a HTTP post. And if you've no idea what I'm talking about there, then check out the chapter on REST-based web services where we'll be looking at post in a lot of detail. If you're happy just to accept that the client has to send this XML message to the web service in order to get back an XML response. Remember that the client could be written in any language, as long as they can send XML messages. It could be Python, C++, Visual Basic, or whatever. But the question I want to ask is, if we're a Java programmer and we want to call a web service, any web service, how do we do it using JAX-WS? So what we'll do, in common with all of the other chapters on remoting, is I'm going to suggest that you temporarily close the project for our JAX-WS test server. But I want you to remember that the server is still running. Do not press the red terminate button. We need that service to be up and running. But I want you to pretend now that you are a client developer. You have no visibility whatsoever of that server code. You don't know what language it's written in. You don't know how it's implemented. But you've been told that you need to access the web service at the URL you can see here. How do we do it? Well, let's first of all create a new project for this. So it's going to be, let's call it JAX-WS test client. And I'm going to write a new class in here, and I'll just call it main. And I'm going to generate a public static void main method. My objective in here is to call that web service. And the only thing we know about this web service at the moment is its URL is, and I think I've still got the URL on my clipboard. Yes, I do. The URL, or at least the URL of the WSDL, is the address you can see here. Where do I start? Well, the way JAX-WS works is it supplies a special tool. It's a tool that's part of your Java development kit. And that tool is supplied the name of the WSDL. And the tool will then generate a set of classes representing that web service. Now remember, we don't know if that web service is written in Visual Basic, Java, or C++ or whatever. But what the tool will do is it will generate some Java classes that represent that web service. It's going to look in the WSDL, and for example, it's going to work out that there's an operation supported called getEmployeeById, and it will generate a Java method called getEmployeeById. And the beauty of that is, here in the client, we can then write Java code that goes off to the server and invokes the server operations regardless of what language that server was written in. The only difficult thing is we do have to run that tool, and it's a little bit of a fiddly command line tool, so I'm going to do this over on a caption. Well, the name of the tool you need to run is called a WS import. This is a standard tool, part of the JDK, so you already have it installed. You don't have to go away and download this. And you're going to be running this tool from inside your projects directory. So that means the directory where you have your src and your bin folder. There's a couple of options here. The -keep option. Now, just to remind you what this tool is going to do, it's going to generate a set of Java classes representing the web service. And at the same time, it will also compile those Java files into binary classes. Now, the -keep option here is simply telling the WS import tool that we would like to keep the original Java source files. And that's quite useful because you might want to inspect the contents of these Java files, and you'll see in a moment that we will want to do exactly that. The -verbose option is not that important. That will just give us some verbose information on the console, so if something goes wrong, we might get a clue from that. Then the -s option here is pointing to the name of our source folder. Now I'm assuming you're using a standard Eclipse project, so that folder is going to be called ./src. The -d option is specifying the destination directory where we want these classes to be compiled, and again, if you're using the standard Eclipse project setup, that's going to be ./bin. If you've used a different name such as classes, then make sure you change it there. And then after a space, the important option here is the WSDL's URL. So that's the URL that I currently have on my clipboard. On previous courses such as our Java EE course where we also use Jax-WS, I did indeed do this through the command line. But that's really quite tedious and awkward and not platform independent. And really, we can do it through Eclipse, of course. I don't know how familiar you are with this process, but the icon here, which is supposed to be a play button and a small toolbox, you need very sharp eyes to tell that, but that's what it's supposed to be, allows you to run external tools in Eclipse. So if you drop that icon down using the little arrow to the right of the icon, you can select the External Tools Configuration option. Select the Program item from here, and then this isn't particularly clear. The icon here is the New Launch Configuration button. Click that, and we can point this dialog box at that WS import tool. The name just needs to be a label that we can remember. We'll keep returning to this, so I suggest WS import. And for location, we're going to need to browse the file system. This step will vary depending on whether you're on Windows, Linux, or Macintosh, so I'll assume you know where to find your Java development kit. On Windows, by default, it generally installs itself on the C drive under the Program Files folder, and then Java, and then you're looking for any of the JDK folders. I have 3 separate versions of Java installed on my computer. I'm going to choose the JDK 1.7 version purely because that's the one I'm using for my development. I don't think it really matters, to be honest. And then in the bin folder, it's going to be right down the bottom, near the bottom, the WS import.exe. And we'll click on Open. For the working directory, I'm not sure if we need this or not, but this is just its root directory that it's working in. And actually, that needs to be the project folder. So just to be sure, we'll add that in by clicking on Browse Workspace and then select your project folder, which is the test client folder. In the arguments box, we now just need the command line arguments that you saw on the previous caption, which was -keep, -verbose. I'm not sure that that one's important, but anyway, then -s ./src. I don't know if we need the other /, but I'll put it in anyway. And then -d for destination, ./bin, followed by another /. And then the last parameter is going to be the WSDL's URL. Well, I happen to still have that on my clipboard, so I'll paste that in there. So the great thing about this is now this is going to be remembered by Eclipse, and when and if we need to rerun this tool, we'll be able to find it from the Tools icon. But I can now click Run. The output from the tool will appear in the console. And this is the kind of output you're looking for. Of course, you don't want to see anything like a stack trace. You want to see generating code followed by quite a few Java files, and then compiling code, and then no errors after the JAVAC line. If that has worked, then the WS import tool has now generated some Java code for us, and you'll be able to find the Java code if you click on your project and select Refresh. You should now see a new package under your SRC folder. Now you might be wondering how it's kind of worked out a package name, given that, remember, the server code might not be written in Java, but it's actually using the namespaces from the WSDL. Now if you don't know what I'm talking about there, it doesn't really matter, and we'll certainly be looking in more detail at that in a later chapter. But for now, it's generated a package. If we have a look in there, there are a series of Java classes. Now I want to make a really important point, and I think I've said this several times, so I'm sorry if I'm boring you, but it bears repeating. Although you know and I know that the server here today has been written in Java, it could have been written in any language. It could have been Visual Basic, for example. But even so, the WS import tool is able to generate, for example, a class called employee.java. And it's done that by inspecting the XML inside the WSDL. It has in no way looked at the code on the server. So this class is purely for the use of the client. And therefore, if the server code had been written in Visual Basic, we would still be seeing a Java class here on the client side. Now this is a generated Java class, so we don't necessarily need to look at what's inside it, but the crucial thing is that it's got an ID and a name, and to make it usable, there's a get ID, a set ID, a get name, and a set name. And I know I keep saying this has not been generated by the WS import tool looking at the Java class on the server. That's why there's no constructor in here. And crucially, there's no toString method in here. That's just on the server version of this class. So the point of this class is that's going to enable us to manipulate employees here on the client. I think perhaps more importantly, we have two classes here representing the actual service itself. We have a generated class called employee service impl, and we have a generated class called, and this is a bit strange because it's been generated, it's called employee service impl, and it has the word service added to the end. That's a little bit unfortunate. That's just the generation here. We call our class service, but it adds another service on the end. Now, the purpose of these two classes is to give us access to the operations defined on the web service. And this class effectively goes behind the scenes and does all of the XML, and it does the actual HTTP call to the server. It's just that actually using these classes is a little bit complicated, and I always find it a little bit of a hoop jumping exercise. Now, in fact, the really important class for our purposes is this one here called employee service impl. That's a generated class that contains Java methods for each of the operations available on the web service. If I have a look in there, it's not a very pretty file to look at, but the key thing is there, buried under a great big pile of annotations, there is a method there called getEmployee by ID. Now that's the method we want to be able to call. But you'll notice that this is an interface. It's not actually a class. Now we're going to need to get hold of a concrete implementation of that class. And the way we do that is by using this second class, the one ending in service. If you want to think of that as a factory class, then it basically is a factory that's going to give us an instance of our service. Now it's a bit of a pain to work with it, but what you do is you create a new instance of this factory. So it's the one with the ugliest name, basically, that we create an instance of. And I think we should be able to import that. I just did Control-Shift and O there. And if you immediately hit a dot after calling the new, you should find a method in there called getEmployeeServiceImpl port. Now, you can remember that term port from before. You can just think of port as being the web service itself. You'll notice crucially that the return type of this object is called employee service impl. If we call that method, then that's going to return, so I'll go to the left hand side, that's going to return an instance of employee service impl, and I'm going to call that web service. Then you're really home and dried, because now on this web service, if I spell it correctly, and hit the dot, you'll now find every single operation that's contained on the server's web service. Now we only have one, of course there's the usual boring Java object methods, but the one method that stands out there is getEmployee by ID. I can pass in an ID. Now remember, we're not actually using the ID on our service implementation, but we could have been, and we know that's going to return an employee. So the purpose of this, that will need to be imported. The purpose of this is to make us as the client programmer think that we're calling regular Java objects. But actually what's going to happen when we call this web service object is it's going to go and do a network call, and it will also convert the data that we've got here into XML message. And when the service responds and returns an XML message back, it will convert it back into this plain regular Java class called employee. It's actually quite slick. So to test that that's worked, I can now do a system.out.println. Now we don't have a toString on this. Remember, this is the client employee. And we've got a choice really. We could go into the generated employee class and add in a toString method, but that's a little bit dangerous because we're going to be regenerating these classes every time the web service changes. Now you can do that if you're careful with your versioning of your classes, but I'm just going to go in and do a getName on that object. So I'm going to emphasize just one last time that what's happening here is that this is going to do a network call and will be accessing our server. Let's see if it works. A right click. Oh, by the way, before I run, you will need to make sure that your exporter from your server is still running. Otherwise this won't work. We'll do a run as Java application, and we have a response. Now I don't know if you did the previous chapter where we had this situation, but I just maximize the console. We've now effectively got two consoles on top of each other. We're seeing here the console for the client. It's hard to tell that this is the client's console, but we know because it's the one that's actually outputting the result. If I click on the button here and drop that down, you can see all of the current live consoles. Console 2 is the one that we're looking at, and it's currently terminated. Whereas console 1, if I click on that, that's the exporter, that's the server, and it's still running. And you could see there was no output there. Just to prove that this really was making a network call to a separate Java virtual machine, if I kill the exporter and then try to run this client again, we are going to see an exception, and well, you can pick through that and you'll see that the connection was refused. It's a Java networking connection exception, exactly what we'd expect to see if the service is down for some reason. So the purpose of this demonstration project was just to give you a basic flavour for how JAX-WS works. This chapter was designed for anyone who hasn't seen the standard Java library of JAX-WS, because Spring is going to make heavy use of it. I hope the overview of SOAP wasn't too basic for you. I did oversimplify, but don't worry, we will go deeper later on, especially on WSDLs. These are a bit of a nightmare to read, although we can rely on auto-generation for at least a while. Eventually, you might need to write your own, and that will be coming later. I really like the JAX-WS library. It makes writing and calling a SOAP web service simple. Perhaps a bit too simple, as we'll see later on, but as a start point, it's pretty slick. Spring makes heavy use of JAX-WS to support SOAP, so in the next chapter we'll find out where Spring fits into all of this.